Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Don't drink that. A homeless man's cry that changed everything. The sun barely broke through the morning mists of San Francisco, barely touching the glass facades of the skyscrapers. The light, filtered through a gray veil, gave the city a cold, almost metallic hue. San Francisco shone on the surface, with its thriving startups, minimalist cafes, and Teslas gliding silently down the avenues, but beneath that brilliance lurked a world of stark contrasts. On the sidewalks of Market Street, in the shadow of steel buildings and giant advertising screens promoting luxury watches, financial services and getaways to Greece, Jaden Brooks, 17, was walking slowly. He wore sneakers with holes in them that let the moisture in, threadbare jeans, and an old sweatshirt 3 sizes too big. Slinging his ever-present canvas bag, stained and threadbare, was his everything: a toothbrush, a torn photo of his mother, a sketchbook, and a blanket that smelled of rain. He hadn't eaten since the day before. He wandered, his eyes on the alert, searching for a discarded leftover, a sandwich left on a fast food table, or simply a human gaze. But in this fast-moving city, no one really saw him. Jaden was tall for his age, but he carried his body like a weight. Thin, his cheeks hollow, his skin sometimes too pale, sometimes too burnt. His thick black hair was tied back with an elastic band he had found on the ground. What was most striking were his eyes, dark, deep, but hard. Too hard for a 17-year-old boy. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much, too soon. For 3 years he lived on the street, on the margins of the world, alongside his little sister Maya, 10 years old. Small, thin as a reed, a fragile cough in her chest, but a bright smile. Despite the hunger, the cold, and the dangers, she always smiled when she saw Jaden coming back, whether it was with a simple slice of stale bread or a holy blanket. To her, he was everything: her brother, her father, her hero. They slept in an alley, wedged between 2 rusty containers, a stone's throw from Union Square, so close to 5-star hotels and jewelry store windows, yet so far from the real world. There, in this pocket of oblivion, they had created a fragile corner with cardboard boxes, a blanket, and plastic bags to protect themselves from the wind. In the morning, they heard the heels of passers-by echoing on the sidewalks, the peals of laughter of tourists, the engines of taxis. But no one stopped. They had lost everything. Their mother, Angela, gentle and strong-willed, had died of an aggressive cancer. Due to a lack of insurance, she had not been able to be treated in time. Their father, Darius, imprisoned for a mistake he hadn't made, had never returned. He had died in prison under unclear circumstances. And the family? Absent. Erased. Silent. No one had come forward to take them. Jaden could have agreed to go to a shelter. Several social workers had suggested it. But he knew those places: violence, theft, separation. He refused to let Maya grow up there. So he chose the street. He learned to survive. To steal, sometimes, but never more than they needed. He ran fast. He knew how to blend into the shadows. He learned by observing, memorizing the habits of passers-by, delivery schedules, the smallest details. His memory was a treasure, and his instinct, an armor. But behind her resilience hid an immense fatigue. The kind of fatigue that doesn't disappear with a night's sleep. The kind of fatigue you carry in your bones, in the silences, in the glances you avoid. That day, the park of Union Square resembled an open-air theater. The central lawn had been covered with a light wooden floor, bordered by green walls, and decorated with green and white banners with carefully chosen slogans. Pure Flow, the water of the future. Drink responsibly, live sustainably. Zero plastic, 100% conscience. A huge stage had been set up in the center, equipped with a designer podium, solar projectors, and LED screens showing images of glaciers, pure springs, and children laughing under waterfalls. The subtle background music gave the impression that we were entering an ecological sanctuary. Everything was designed to motion, support, media impact. A dense crowd had gathered, made up of international journalists, influential investors, committed celebrities, eager startuppers, and curious onlookers drawn by the promise of a grandiose event. Smartphones were already filming, drones buzzed overhead, capturing every angle of the scene. Because that day was much more than just a product launched at IT, was a public act of faith, a political proclamation, a carefully planned image operation. At the center of this dazzling setting stood William Langford, 56 years old, CEO of Langford Inc., a multi-billion-dollar tech empire, a pioneer in renewable energy, and a beloved figure in Silicon Valley. He had built his image like a monument, visionary, uncompromising, elite environmentalist, and a selective philanthropist. His words carried weight. His actions were scrutinized. His words, calculated. Langford took the stage with the confidence of a man who had learned to command a room before he even opened his mouth. Tall, with carefully combed gray hair and a square jaw, he wore a light beige suit without a crease, an ivory shirt, and a forest green tie, the color of nature, balance, and promise. He takes the main. An immediate silence fell. The chatter stopped. The cameras focused. Langford spoke in a calm, deep, measured voice, like a head of state addressing a nation in expectation. Today, my friends, we are not just launching a bottle of water. We are launching Apromise. That of a purer, more transparent future, more respectful of our planet. He paused. The screens behind him showed images of forests, plastic-free seas, children in solar-powered schools in Africa. Every drop of pure flow comes from a natural source, filtered without chemicals, packaged without petroleum, and distributed without carbon. It's more than a product. It's a symbol. A vision. A gentle revolution. A thunderous applause erupted. Langford held out his hand. A hostess handed him a cylindrical bottle, minimalist in design, made of recycled glass. A thin, matte white and silver label read simply, Pure Flow. In clean letters. No plastic. No visible barcodes. Just the product. The idea. The image. He held it in his hand for a few seconds, as if to make it the center of the world. Then he slowly unscrewed it, leaving a slight hiss escape from the cork. The noise seemed to resonate throughout the square. Some journalists leaned forward. Flashbulbs crackled. Langford smiled. He raised the bottle to his lips, ready to take the first sip in front of the whole world. At that precise moment, the silence was total. The moment was suspended. It was then that fate decided to strike. It was then that the cry split the air like a detonation. Don't drink that. The sound cracked like thunder in the solemn silence of the event. William Langford's arm froze, the bottle still inches from his lips. The cameras, the drones, the microphones, everything seemed suspended. The crowd turned as one, as one. Murmurs rose, agitated, sharp, tense. Who shouted? What did he say? Was that planned? The black-suited security guards appeared immediately, surging through the crowd like waves. Two of them had already placed their hands on their earpieces, coordinating their movements. They scanned the crowd. And then we saw it. A young boy had just forced his way through the security barriers, knocking into a photographer and sliding between two stands that he ran, panting, desperate, his breath ripped from the effort, his eyes wide open. Jaden. His clothes hung on him like rags. His sweatshirt was covered in stains, his pants soaked at the hems. His shoes, too small for his feet, squeaked with every step. His face was blackened by dust, but his clear, deep eyes burned with urgency. A guard grabbed his arm, but Jaden jerked free, barely able to stand. He staggered to the edge of the stage, arms raised, short of breath, broken voice, but his gaze remained fixed on Langford. Langford looked at him now, puzzled, annoyed at first. He frowned, as if trying to figure out if this was a poorly orchestrated publicity stunt, an activist happening, or just an intrusion. "What are you doing here, kid?" he said, a little sharp, suspicious, but curious despite himself. Jaden leaned against the barrier, gasping for air. He lifted his head, and in a desperate cry, said everything he knew. I saw a man last night, he was in your warehouse at Port 17. He was wearing a jacket with your company logo. I was sleeping there. He thought no one was looking, but I was there. I saw him put liquid in several cases of water, he poisoned the bottles. A deathly silence fell. The audience, the journalists, the cameras, everything was frozen. Some burst out laughing nervously. Others took a step back, uncertain. A man shouted, "Is this a joke?" A woman in a suit whispered to her colleague, "He's hallucinating. He's probably on drugs." But William Langford wasn't laughing. The security guards had moved to grab Jayden, ready to discreetly remove him from the scene. But Langford raised his hand. "Wait." He slowly descended the steps of the stage. His gaze was now entirely absorbed by the boys. He stopped less than a meter away from him. He scrutinized his face, his breathing, his gaze looking for a flaw. A lie. A setup. But there was none of that. Only fear. Raw. Authentic. And fierce determination. Not that of a capricious child. Not that of a young person trying to exist. But that of someone who knows he risks everything by speaking, but speaks anyway. Langford, still motionless, slowly handed the bottle to one of his assistants. "Get it tested. Now." In front of everyone. An invisible shock wave rippled through the crowd. Whispers rose, worried glances were exchanged. The cameras began rolling at full speed again, this time without a script, without a PR plan, without a set. The scene had just changed. The media hero was no longer alone at the center. A stranger, a street kid, had just shaken up the scene. And the world suddenly held its breath. Testing began barely 30 minutes after the incident. In a mobile health control unit, parked backstage for routine logistical checks, 3 chemists in white coats quickly began working. The silence in the small laboratory was tense, punctuated only by the metallic clang of instruments, the whirring of machines, and instructions exchanged in hushed tones. The bottles were sealed, opened under surveillance, sampled, and then precisely analyzed. Meanwhile, the event had been interrupted. The screens on stage had been turned off. Guests had been asked to stay within a secure perimeter. The journalists, for their part, were already seething. The rumor spread like wildfire through the crowd. Was there really poison? Is this kid a hero or a saboteur? An hour later, the verdict was announced. Proven presence of organic toxins. Substances that are non-lethal in low doses, but highly dangerous if ingested for a long time. Contamination identified in 3 different crates. And sabotage. A rapid investigation, coupled with warehouse surveillance cameras and access logs, enabled the suspect to be identified. Andrew Nolan, former chemist employed by Langford Inc., dismissed 3 months earlier for serious misconduct. A bitter, unstable man with a troubled past. He had kept an unlocked access badge and had entered the premises one rainy night, thinking he would leave no trace. He did not know that someone was sleeping there. Jayden. When William Langford received the results, he stood motionless in his dressing room, the sheets of the report trembling slightly between his fingers. For a long minute, he said nothing. His gaze was fixed, staring into space. He, the visionary, the strategist, the green tech giant, had just escaped a symbolic death live, before the eyes of the whole world. And he owed this life to a teenager without a home, without status, without a voice. He slowly closed the file and whispered to his security chief. "Where is the boy?" "Outside. Sitting on a bench." "He didn't ask anything." "He thought you were going to call the police." Langford nodded. Then, without escort, without microphone, without camera, he went out to find him. Jayden stood there, huddled on the edge of a wooden bench, arms crossed over his chest, eyes fixed on the ground. The crowd avoided him, some watched from afar, others passed by without even noticing. He was invisible again, a mere intruder, forgotten as quickly as he had appeared. When he saw Langford approaching slowly, a shiver ran through him. He thought about running away, reflexively. He was used to it. Rich people never came with good news for people like him. But Langford stopped in front of him, simply. Without threat. Without arrogance. They looked at each other. Two opposing worlds. Two men at opposite ends of the spectrum. But the same silence. The same moment of truth. Langford finally spoke, softly. You risked your life to save mine. Why? Jaden looked up. There was no pride, no defiance. Just an ancient sadness, deep, too heavy for a boy of his age. He looked down and replied. Because I didn't want to see someone die in front of me. Again. Langford felt his defenses fall. This brief answer contained a whole world: grief, pain, loss, courage, and incredible dignity. He understood that Jaden's story went beyond the event. That same evening, Langford gave clear and irrevocable instructions. Jaden and his little sister Maya were transferred to a secure apartment, furnished, bright, in a quiet neighborhood. A medical team was dispatched to monitor Maya's condition. Psychologists, school tutors, and specialized educators were hired to support them. But Langford didn't stop there. 3 weeks later, in a global press conference held at Stanford University, he announced the creation of the Foundation Jaden Brooks. A national program dedicated to help for homeless youth, to their education, their health, their safety, and above all, to their voice. Langford hired him $100 million initial funds, and promised to contribute 10% of Lawn Guard Incorporated's annual profits. That he entrusted Jaden with a symbolic role on advisory board, an unprecedented gesture for a young person who had lived on the streets. The whole world was shocked by this story. The media made it their headlines for weeks. A homeless man saves a billionaire's life, and changes the destinies of thousands of children. Jaden Brooks, from shadow to light. The voice that prevented the worst. And all over the country, children, teachers, families began to pronounce his name with respect. Jaden. 3 years later. Evening was falling gently on the historic campus of the University of Berkeley. Streetlights lit the tree-lined paths, and the air carried the smell of paper, coffee, and hope that is characteristic of places of learning. The Great Sibley Hall Amphitheater, usually reserved for conferences by eminent researchers or political debates, was fully booked. On the ranks, hundreds of students, professors, journalists, personalities from the associative and political world waited in silence, their eyes fixed on the stage. No music, no spectacular staging, just a light wooden lectern, a microphone, and a name projected in simple letters on the giant screen. Jaden Brooks. At 20, Jaden was now an international relations student, an honorary scholar, symbol of a new fight, that of restoring dignity to those we refuse to see. That evening he wore a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit, a white shirt, no tie. He had grown, gained muscle, weight, calm. But in his eyes still burned the same intensity, that of a boy who had crossed the flames. In the room, in the third row, Maya, now a teenager, sat upright. She wore her burgundy private school uniform, her hair braided, her eyes shining with admiration. Beside her were teachers, friends, and 2 former daycare workers. She barely blinked. She didn't want to miss anything. In the front row, William Langford, his face marked by the years, but dignified, looked at the scene without saying a word. He was dressed soberly, his hands crossed on his knees. Behind his glasses, his eyes were wet. When Jaden went on stage, the silence was absolute. No breath. No whisper. He positioned himself behind the microphone, placed both hands on the edges of the lectern, and slowly scanned the room. He had no notes. Then he spoke. His voice was calm, measured, and full of truth. I'm not here to tell a success story. I'm here because one day, I screamed. He stopped. A scream from nowhere. From the asphalt. From the alley where I lived with my little sister. A scream from a crowd that wasn't expecting me. A scream I should never have dared to utter. He paused. Some students leaned forward. That scream wasn't an act of courage. I wasn't a hero. I was a hungry, dirty, tired, invisible kid. But that scream, it was a cry of hope, the hope that at least one person hears me. He closed his eyes for a moment. That day, I was heard. But how many other voices, every day, are not? How many children sleep in the cold, how many young people disappear without a glance? The world too often forgets those it doesn't want to see. It looks away. It turns off the radio. It crosses the street. He leaned slightly towards the microphone, lower, deeper. But what I learned is that those we ignore today, could well be those who save us tomorrow. A shudder ran through the room. Jaden squared his shoulders, looked straight ahead. So I made a promise. That if one day I had a voice, I would give it back to those who can no longer scream. That promise became the Jaden Brooks Foundation. It wasn't born of charity. It was born of debt. The debt of having been saved, by saving someone else. In the room, the first applause broke out, shy, sincere. Then, like a wave, they grew, rose, filled the space. But one thing happened that made the whole assembly shudder. William Langford said lever. Slowly. Silently. With tears in my eyes. And he applauded. For a long time. Without looking away, he applauded this man whom he had first perceived as an intruder, then discovered as an alert, and finally recognized as a mirror of everything he had ignored. That evening, it was not a billionaire greeting a student. He was a man standing there saluting a survivor who had become a leader. Jaden tilted his head slightly. No smile. No vanity. Just a promise kept.